Unbelievable. Well, welcome this morning. It's good to see everybody here this morning. I want to ask you a question this morning. How many of you have ever heard the expression, a place for everything and everything in its place? Right? You've heard of that, right? How many of you live in a household where there's someone who believes that in that statement? How many of you live in a household that has someone in it that believes that? How many of you are that person? Yeah, okay. A place for everything and everything in its place means that everything you have, there should be a place where it stays so that when you need it, you can go find it, right? And when you're done with it, you do what? You put it back, right? Right. God's own words, right? Now, in my household, I have 5 people. There are 3 people that believe that there is a place for everything and everything in its place. There are 2 people who do not believe that. Now, you would think that the conflict would always be between the people who believe that everything has a place and the people that don't believe that everything has a place, right? The problem is that the 3 people in my household that believe that everything has a place and it should always be there don't always agree on the same place for everything, right? X belongs here. No, X belongs here. Right? Yesterday we had a little incident where one of the members of the family who believes this rule came to me and said, I can't find the Windex. The Windex belongs in the downstairs bathroom on the top shelf on the left, and it is not there. Someone else has used the Windex and not put it back in its appropriate place. The person who had used the Windex was also a person who believes there is a place for everything and everything should be in its place, and they put it in the place where they thought it ought to be. I was not one of the parties of this dispute, but I got pulled into the dispute because I had to find said Windex for the person who was looking for it. Things like this cause conflict, right? The problem becomes when we take that rule of a place for everything and everything in its place, and we start to try to apply that to people, right? I'll give you some examples. What happens in high schools? There's this class system, there's this clique system in high schools where if you're of a certain whatever, you belong over here. You don't belong in our group. You stay in your place over here. Our place is over here. How about things like segregated lunch counters back in the 50s and 60s, segregated bus stations, segregated schools? This is your place. You stay here. This is my place. I belong here. Don't come into my place. You stay in your own place. When we take that rule and apply it to people, it has devastating results. This morning, I want to take a look at a story in Jesus' life where this rule was being carried out to almost a ridiculous degree. We're going to be looking in Mark chapter 11. Mark chapter 11. We're just going to read a few verses of this story. It starts in verse 15. And it said, when Jesus returned to Jerusalem, he went into the temple and began to throw out those who were buying and selling there. He turned over the tables of those who were exchanging different kinds of money, and he upset the benches of those who were selling doves. Jesus refused to allow anyone to carry goods through the temple courts. So it says here that Jesus went into the temple, and here at the end of the passage it says that he wouldn't allow anyone to carry any goods through the temple courts. Now, as you may or may not know, the temple in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus wasn't like walking into the church building here at Edgewood, right? You walk into this building, you either come through the doors here by the visitor center, or you come through the fellowship hall, and you can come in through the doors and you can go just about anywhere you want to go, right? Toby, you can't go to the ladies' room though, right? We have some rules like that. That we have some areas that have some restrictions, but pretty much you could walk in and go anywhere you want to in this building. But in the temple was very different. The temple had a place for everyone, and everyone had to stay in their place. The temple was made up of several different areas, several different levels, and they were called courts. Now, listen, let me just stop you right here. I'm not intending to give you a full lesson on the Temple of Jerusalem today. I am not going to tell you all about all the architectural features and every little rule. If you want me to, I will. I've got the next 8 hours with nothing to do. We can talk about all that stuff, but that's not my intent here this morning, okay? My intent here is to show you or to give you a very high-level view of the Temple of Jerusalem so that we can understand what's going on here, so that we can understand Jesus' actions as he comes into the temple. Because just reading that, it might sound like Jesus is just having a bad day and he starts throwing stuff around, right? But you have to understand something about the temple to understand what Jesus is doing here. So as you come into the temple, you move into toward the center. There's several different courts, several different levels. And this is a very rough diagram. It is not to scale. Please don't tell me that it's drawn wrong, okay? This is just a way to get you to understand what the temple in Jerusalem was like at the time of Jesus. We're going to start on the inside and work our way out, okay? We're going to start here. I'm going to try to do this from up here. We're going to start right here with this little box right there called the Holy of Holies. It is the inner sanctuary of the temple. In traditional Judaism, it is the most sacred place in the world. This is where God lives. This is where God appears. In the old temple, in Solomon's temple, this room would have contained what? The Ark of the Covenant, right? You all know it from Indiana Jones. The big gold box with the cherubs over it. This stayed in the Holy of Holies in the days of the Temple of Solomon. It was a chest covered with gold inside and out. And Hebrews chapter 9, verses 3 and 4 tell us that what was in it was the tablets of the covenant, the Ten Commandments, a bowl of manna, and Aaron's rod that budded. And in the time of Solomon, it stayed in there because that box represented God with his people, right? Now, when the temple was rebuilt in Jerusalem, after it was destroyed in, I think it was 1587 BC, during the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem, they carried away the Ark of the Covenant. It was gone. So in the temple in Jesus' time, there was no Ark of the Covenant in there. So what they did, they raised the floor up a little bit to kind of signify where it would have been. But the Holy of Holies was the most sacred spot. And there was only one person who was allowed to go in there, and that was the high priest. It was a very exclusive level of the temple. Only one person could go in there. And he can only go in there once a year to offer blood sacrifice and incense for the sins of the people. He would sprinkle that blood on top of that gold chest that you see there. So this was in a very exclusive place in the temple. The next place inside the temple, the first of many courts, was called the Court of the Priests. That's what it was called in Jesus' time. Before it wasn't called, in Solomon's time, it wasn't called the Court of the Priests. It was called the Holy Place. You had the Holy Place, and then you had the Most Holy Place. This is another exclusive level of the temple. To get in here, you had to be a priest. You had to be a Levite. They were the only people that were allowed to go into the court of the priests. And inside this court, you had this enormous altar. When I say enormous, I mean enormous. 45 feet wide, 45 feet wide, 45 feet deep, and 22 feet high. And a big ramp to get to the top of it. It was made out of stones, not carved stones, not beautified stones, just stones, uncut stones. This huge 45 by 45 foot altar. It could be seen from the other courts of the temple, but no one else other than priests were allowed to go in to the court of the priests. Outside that court, you had another court called the Court of the Men of Israel. To get into this court, you had to be of full Israelite blood, and you had to be a man. This was the boys' club. You were not allowed to go in there if you were a woman. The next court outside of that we have was called the Court of Israel, or it was often referred to as the Court of Women. And it wasn't because only women were in there, it was because that was as far as women were allowed to go. When they came into the temple, they could go into the Court of Israel, but they could go no further. See how we have these levels, these dividing barriers for people, right? And to the temple authorities, this court of Israel, right here, inside there was technically the temple. Technically, that was the temple. So you know what they did? They built a wall around that area of the temple. It wasn't a high wall. It was only 5 feet tall. They built a 5-foot wall to signify to get through this wall, to come into this wall, you had to be Israelite. Not half Israelite, half something else. Not granddad was an Israelite and grandma was a Moabite. You had to be of pure blood to get in there. And on this 5-foot wall, they would put at every entrance, they would put this sign. This is an artifact that's been displayed in the Museum of Istanbul in Turkey. And you can see what it says there. Maybe you can't. Let me tell you what it says there. This stone was a warning stone put at every entrance to go into the temple. And it said, this is kind of funny. It says, and I'm paraphrasing, foreigners have the freedom of access to the temple of God, provided they don't go beyond this wall if you're uncircumcised or if you're a Gentile. Doing so will place upon you a sentence of death. Feel free to go anywhere you want to in the temple, just don't come in if you're a Gentile. And that's where it leads us to our last court here. You can see at the very outskirts, all around the outside of the temple, is something called the Court of the Gentiles. That's us. The Court of the Gentiles. Anyone was allowed to go into the Court of the Gentiles. Anybody. For any reason. It wasn't technically part of the temple. So people could come and go as they pleased there. Now, let me just stop here for a minute and remind you of something. And Matt and I were kind of talking about this morning. You know, if you go to the Bible and look at the instructions that God gave for the building of his temple, you're not going to find anything that says the Court of the Gentiles. You're not going to find anything that says the Court of Israel or the Court of Men of Israel. You're not going to find that. You know why? Because it ain't there. Well, how to get there? You know how it got there. We put it there. People like us. We put in the Court of the Gentiles so that we can say, you know what, Gentiles, sure, you're welcome. Just don't come in. Because if you do, we'll kill you. All right? The Court of the Gentiles, it was open to anybody. Anyone was allowed to come and enter. If you were a Gentile and you had converted to Judaism, this is where you came to worship God. This is where you came to offer prayers, to the Court of the Gentiles. If you had a hot dog truck and you wanted to sell hot dogs outside the temple, you'd come to the Court of the Gentiles. Kosher hot dogs. You know what? I didn't even think about that. Thank you. Thank you, Anthony. Well, it is Gentiles, so they could, you know. This Court of the Gentiles, it was the largest court in the temple in Jerusalem. And it was like a flea market. It was a bazaar. You had vendors selling food and clothing. You had vendors selling souvenirs. Mom and Dad went to the temple, and all I got was this crummy T-shirt, right? Anyone could come into the Court of the Gentiles. And one of the things that was in the Court of the Gentiles were what we go back to the scripture we're looking at this morning. It talks about there were people in there that were exchanging different kind of currency, the money changers. You got to remember at this time, Judea was under the rule of the Romans, right? And so the currency of the day was Roman coinage. And in that region, you might have people that are using Greek coins, Egyptian coins. To come into the temple, all Jews were required to pay what's called the temple tax, or the sanctuary tax. It was a half shekel. Now, Jews, the Israelites at that time, would not accept Roman, Egyptian, or Greek coins. You know why? Because they had graven images on them, images of man. They didn't want any of those graven images in the temple. So to pay your temple tax, if you were a Jew from Greece, you came into town with some Greece money, you weren't allowed to pay it in your Greece money. You had to exchange it. Like exchanging American money for Canadian money. They wanted to exchange it so they could pay their half shekel temple tax. So you had people in there that were changing currency. And, quite frankly, it was a matter of convenience. If you had traveled a great distance and you were coming to the temple, one stop, right? Go into the temple, exchange your money, pay your tax, you were all done. We also needed money, if you were coming from a great distance, to buy sacrifices. And to buy those sacrifices, they might not accept an Egyptian coin, so you would exchange a currency. And what else was in the Gentile court? Cattle dealers. There were cattle auctions going on inside the court of the Gentiles. So you could walk over with your exchanged money, and you could buy a sheep, a bull, some doves, some pigeons, salt, oil, anything you needed to make your sin offering or your Thanksgiving offerings to God. It was all right there. Exchange your money, buy your stuff, boom, all done. You can imagine, though, this court of the Gentiles was, like I said, it was like a flea market. Can you imagine trying to worship in the flea market? Can you imagine that? But that's what the Gentiles who were converted to Judaism were faced with. You think about it, this business of exchanging money, this business of selling animals, at a time like Passover, where there may be 300,000 or 400,000 pilgrims new to the city coming in, needing to exchange currency, needing to buy sacrifices, you can imagine what a lucrative business this was for some people, especially doves and pigeons. They were the least expensive sacrifice that God would accept for sin sacrifices. And so poor people who had traveled great distances, who were short on cash, they'd buy birds, pigeons, and doves. The dove industry in Jerusalem was huge, and particularly inside the temple, inside the Gentile court, it was a very lucrative business. And if you could get the right vendor license to go in there from the temple authorities, you could do very well for yourself. So when the scripture speaks that Jesus returned to Jerusalem and he came into the temple, and below it talks about carrying goods through the temple courts, this whole episode happens in the court of the Gentiles. It happens in the court of the Gentiles, where he cleans out the temple. But inside the walls where the Israelites were, the purebloods, not in the Holy of Holies, not in the holy place, it was in the court of the Gentiles that Jesus cleans this all out. After he completed turning over tables and driving out people and animals, Jesus gives a very simple explanation about why he has done what he's done. In verse 17, he said, he taught the people, saying, "It is written in the scriptures, my temple will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you are changing God's house into a hideout for robbers." There's a common explanation of why Jesus did this, why Jesus drove these people out of the temple. And our first inclination, and the inclination of many, would be to believe this, and because it's true, the first inclination for us to say is the reason he cleaned out the temple was because there might have been a lot of dishonest trading going on in there. There was a lot of thievery going on in there because of the unscrupulous business practices of the money changers, of the cattle dealers, and indirectly, the business practices of the temple authorities themselves. Because to get a cattle selling license or a currency selling license, you had to go through the temple authorities. And all the money you made, well, you had to pay a kickback to the temple authorities. You had to pay for the right to be in there selling. These were the robbers that Jesus spoke of, robbing the poor and the travelers and the widows and the orphans of their money. The money changers who were there for convenience to help exchange currency, they would charge a fee for doing it, which, that makes sense. That's all right. When I go to the ATM, I expect to pay an ATM fee at some of these places, right? Is it okay to pay $1 more? Yeah, okay, I'll pay $1 more. Some ATMs say $2. Some I've said $3. Are you kidding me? Some of these exchangers of money would charge you 15% of the dollar amount you want to exchange. So if you're a poor pilgrim from Greece and you've come to Jerusalem for Passover and you wanted to change $20, That's a $3 ATM fee right there on 20 bucks. You know this half shekel I was talking about that you pay your temple tax for? That represented 2 days' labor for a lot of these people. 2 days' labor to pay your temple tax. 15% on top of that you'd have to pay just to change your money into a half shekel to pay your tax. And if you were a Gentile who had converted to Judaism, there was a fee on top of that. This sounds like modern-day banking, doesn't it? Jesus would have a field day at Citizens Bank, I'm telling you. They were being unfair to the traveler, to the poor, to the Gentile who had converted to Judaism. They were finding every which way to make an extra buck on them. And because so many thousands came to the Passover, changing money at 15% interest was a very profitable business to be in. And those who sold the livestock, you know how the price of gas goes up in the summertime? Because everyone's going to do a lot of traveling, so the oil comes, so they'll jack the price up. Doves would go from $5 in our currency, basically $5 to $50. They would go up 10 times over the Passover feast, when the Passover was in town, basically. 10 times. But that wasn't where the racket ended there on the livestock. You know, if you said, hey, you know what, I'm not going to pay those ridiculous fees in the Gentile court for my animals, I'm going to bring my own with me. So here I come with my own sheep. There are inspectors there waiting for you at the door to make sure that your sheep is unblemished. And you pay them to inspect your sheep before you can go in. And guess what would happen? The inspectors always found something wrong with your sheep. But you know what the inspector do? It's your lucky day. Your sheep's no good, but guess what? My brother-in-law, right over here, he happens to be selling sheep. And if you tell him Aknod sent you, he'll give you a good deal on a nice used sheep. So go over here and buy your sheep from him, and guess who would get a kickback on that? The temple authorities. This was profit-taking at its worst. People coming to worship God, coming to ask for forgiveness of their sins, to pray to Him, and people are looking to turn a profit on that. This business activity is what caused Jesus to call this place the hideout for robbers. You'll notice that this phrase, if you look it up in your Bible, you'll notice as it is here, it's in quotations. A hideout for robbers. It's because Jesus here is quoting Old Testament scripture. And to the trained ear, to maybe some of those temple authorities who were standing by as he was turning over tables, they'd know what he was talking about here. He's referring to Jeremiah chapter 7, verses 3 through 11. And I want to read through that scripture with you here this morning, because to understand what Jesus is doing, we need to understand what he's talking about, right? We need to go back and see, what are you quoting, Jesus? What are you telling these people here? So let's read through it. I know it's 8 verses, so let's read through it together. This is what the Lord all-powerful, the God of Israel, says: change your lies and do what is right. Then I will let you live in this place. Don't trust the lies of the people who say, this is the temple of the Lord, this is the temple of the Lord, this is the temple of the Lord. You must change your lives and do what is right. Be fair to each other. You must not be hard on strangers, orphans, and widows. Don't kill innocent people in this place. Don't follow other gods, or they will ruin your lives. If you do these things, I will let you live in this land that I gave to your ancestors to keep forever. But look, you are trusting lies which are useless. Will you steal and murder and be guilty of adultery? Will you falsely accuse other people? Will you burn incense to the god of Baal and follow other gods you have not known? If you do that, do you think you can come before me and stand in this place where I have chosen to be worshipped? Do you think you can stand here where I've chosen to be worshipped, committing these type of sins? Do you think you can say that we are safe when you do these hateful things? This place where I have chosen to be worshipped is nothing more to you than a hideout for robbers. I have been watching you, says the Lord. You see the phrase here, the hideout for robbers, back here in Jeremiah that Jesus uses. Throughout this passage, God commands his people to be fair with one another, not to be hard on strangers, not to take advantage of the poor and the widows. And then he says, do you think you can commit all these sins? Do you think you can do all this stuff and then think you can come in here into the temple and think you're safe because you're in the temple? You think you can stand before me, having done all these things, and think you'll be pleasing to me somehow? Leave. That's what Jesus is doing here. He's saying, you can't stand here before my God, before my Father, and do these things. Jesus' actions here are in line with what the book of Jeremiah says. Jesus wasn't going to allow these people to stand in his place of worship and think they can commit these sins. There's also a verse in Malachi chapter 3 that talks about, says almost the exact same thing in Malachi, and the writer there says, you cannot be unfair to foreigners. Don't be unfair or hard on foreigners. That would be enough, wouldn't it? That would be enough for Jesus to want to clean out the temple because of all this thievery going on in his place of worship. People turning a profit on being God, on worshiping God. But I have to tell you, there's something bigger going on here. There's something more significant going on here. I want you to notice back in this passage of Mark that there is actually another phrase that's in quotations. Jesus here is quoting another Old Testament passage. He's kind of mixing and matching Old Testament passages and putting them into one sentence to get his point across. He says, my temple will be called a house for prayer for the people of all nations. Notice what it does not say. It does not say that my temple will be a place of prayer for the nation of Israel. He says that it is a place of worship, a place of prayer for all nations. He's mixing and matching two different Old Testament scriptures to get his entire motivation explained. Jesus here is quoting another scripture from the Old Testament, Isaiah chapter 56. And from my perspective, this is really what's going on here in the Gentile court. Here's what Isaiah 56 says. Foreigners will join the Lord to worship him and love him, to serve him, to obey the law about the Sabbath, and to keep my agreement. I will bring these people. What people? Foreigners. I will bring these people to my holy mountain and give them joy in my house of prayer. The offerings and sacrifices they place on my altar will be pleasing to me, because my temple will be called a house of prayer for people from all nations. God's intent from the beginning was his temple would be a place where all nations would gather together. But by the time of Jesus, that's not how the temple authorities saw it. That's not how the Israelites saw it. This was not a place for everyone. The Gentiles had their place, and they needed to stay there. They made it clear by filling the one place where they could worship with livestock and banking and hot dog stands. And that's how temple authorities saw the Gentiles. You're livestock. You can stay out with the cattle. We don't want you any closer to our God than that. The Gentile court was the furthest away from the Holy of Holies. It was insulated, if you will, from the Gentiles because the Gentiles, they're not really part of God's family. We need to keep them out. And through the infernal din of animals and the smell, the noise, all the bartering and negotiating that was going on, how could it possibly be easy to worship God, to meditate on God, to pray to God with all that going on around you? We have to look at this from Jesus' perspective. The temple that was created to bring all men to him, there were his people putting up obstacles, preventing others from coming to him. And it would be only a few days before Jesus would go and remove the biggest obstacle between us and God. He would go to the cross to remove the barrier of sin, and here are his people putting up new obstacles, preventing people from taking advantage of that. Could there be anything more maddening to Jesus than that? His people putting up obstacles, barriers, building walls that say, enter this wall and you die. You're seeking God? Sorry. Stay out with the cattle. You're far away from God because you're not an Israelite. Jesus' cleansing of the temple was to restore the original intent of the temple, that all nations would come to him. We look back in the book of 1 Kings when Solomon built the first temple. Listen to what he says in his dedication. He says, people who are not Israelites, foreigners from other lands, will hear about your greatness and power. They will come from far away to pray at this temple. Then hear them from your home in heaven. Do whatever they ask. Then people everywhere will know and respect you, just as your people in Israel do. Then everyone will know I built this temple as a place of worship for you, a place where all are welcome to worship God, to seek God. A few weeks ago, we looked at a scripture that said that we are like living stones being built into a spiritual temple. If the original intent of the temple in Jerusalem was to have all nations come in and worship God and pray to God, what do you think the intent is of the new spiritual temple? The new spiritual temple is a place where all can come to worship God. They can come to seek Him. It wouldn't be our purpose then to put obstacles in their way, would it? As the new spiritual temple of God. It would be our purpose to go out and make sure that obstacles are removed, that all would have an avenue to find God. It certainly wouldn't be to put obstacles in their way or to make things difficult for people. And so I have to ask myself, are there things that I do to put roadblocks in front of people who are trying to find God? I think we all have to ask ourselves that question individually and as a church. Are there things that we do as a church that prevent people from coming and seeking God here? Are there things that we do in our worship service that turn people away or that put up a barrier between God and them? And I'm sure some of these things that we do, they're not intentional. They may be unintentional, but it just might be something that we're doing that prevents that. It might be something in our song service. It might be something we do during communion. It might be something that I say up here when I'm speaking. Something that says, you know what, that's too big of an obstacle to get over for me to seek God here. Maybe it's the lives that we lead. Maybe we create barriers and obstacles for people who we see as far away from God by the way we live our lives, by the way we conduct ourselves. People look at you and say, boy, if that's the way a Christian handles things, maybe not for me. Maybe this isn't for me. Maybe we put barriers and obstacles in front of people who are seeking God by placing rules on them that God never placed on them, by putting requirements on them that God doesn't place on them. Well, you know what? You straighten out that thing in your life there, then you come on back and you can worship with us. I thought it was the other way around, man. I thought it was, your life's messed up, come here and God will help you straighten your life out, not get your life straight and then come see God. Do we put those kind of obstacles in front of people? It is wrong. And it displeases God to make it difficult for anyone or any group of people to come to worship Him, whether it's based on age or male or female, black or white, rich or poor, whatever it is. We are here to facilitate it, not to put barriers up. And so as we examine ourselves to see if there's any things that we need to address, if there's obstacles, whether intentional or unintentional, that we have placed, we need to go back to that scripture in Jeremiah, and we need to be willing to change. Change what we're doing so that the foreigner can come in, so those people that we view as far away from God can come close to Him. Jesus cleaned out the temple court that was supposed to be for those who were seen as being far from God. It is time for us to clean out the courts. There should be only one court. A court for everyone and everyone in one court. I'd ask you today, just examine yourself. Examine us. And if we need to make changes to let the foreigners in, to let them know that they're worth more than cattle, we need to make those changes. Let's all stand together and sing.